The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Sergeant David Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be just another routine day of royal duty. At 52, David had served the royal family for over 2 decades, maintaining the same stoic professionalism that had earned him his position among the elite royal guard. His weathered hands, marked by years of military service, smoothed down his red tunic one final time before taking his position at the castle's main entrance. David's life had become a careful routine of duty, discipline, and deliberate emotional distance. It wasn't always this way. 25 years ago, he had been a different man entirely, a devoted father to his 7-year-old daughter Emma, a loving husband to his wife Sarah, and a soldier who believed that life held endless possibilities. But tragedy has a way of reshaping even the strongest souls, and David's transformation began on a rainy Tuesday evening in March when a drunk driver changed everything. The accident had taken both his wife and daughter in an instant. David, who had been working late that night, received the call that shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. In the months that followed, he threw himself into his military career with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The rigid structure of army life became his anchor in a world that no longer made sense. When the opportunity arose to join the Royal Guard, David seized it without hesitation. The ceremonial duties, the unwavering protocols, and the emotional detachment required for the job suited his broken heart perfectly. For years, David had maintained his professional facade flawlessly. He stood guard during state functions, royal weddings, and countless public appearances without so much as a flicker of emotion crossing his weathered face. His colleagues respected his dedication, though many noted the sadness that seemed to live permanently in his gray eyes. David preferred it that way. The less anyone knew about his personal pain, the easier it became to function. On this particular morning, however, something felt different. Perhaps it was the unusually bright sunshine that reminded him of Emma's laughter, or maybe it was the way the spring flowers in the castle gardens seemed to bloom with renewed vigor. Whatever it was, David found his thoughts drifting to memories he usually kept locked away in the deepest corners of his mind. As he took his position, David noticed the increased activity around the castle. Today marked Princess Charlotte's 8th birthday, and preparations for a small family celebration were underway. Staff members hurried back and forth, carrying decorations and party supplies, their faces bright with the kind of joy that comes from organizing something special for a child. David watched them with a mixture of professional interest and carefully suppressed emotion. Princess Charlotte had always been a particular favorite among the staff, though David had maintained his usual professional distance. At 8 years old, she possessed a natural warmth and curiosity that seemed to draw people toward her like moths to a flame. Unlike many children born into privilege, Charlotte displayed a genuine interest in the people around her, often stopping to chat with gardeners, asking cooks about their recipes, and showing remarkable empathy for others. David had observed these interactions from afar, filing them away as professional observations rather than personal moments. He told himself that maintaining emotional distance was not only appropriate but necessary. Getting attached to the royal children would be a breach of professional conduct, he reasoned, and, besides, his heart had endured enough pain for one lifetime. As the morning progressed, David watched various family members arrive for the birthday celebration. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge entered with their characteristic grace, followed by other relatives carrying colorfully wrapped gifts. The atmosphere around the castle grew increasingly festive, and, despite his best efforts to remain detached, David found himself remembering Emma's 8th birthday party, the last one they had celebrated together. Emma had worn a princess dress that day, twirling around their small garden while Sarah took what seemed like hundreds of photographs. They had invited the entire neighborhood, and their modest home had been filled with laughter, cake crumbs, and the sweet chaos that only children can create. David remembered standing in their kitchen doorway, watching Emma blow out her candles, thinking that life couldn't possibly get any better. The memory struck him with unexpected force, causing his jaw to tighten almost imperceptibly. Years of practice had taught him to manage these emotional ambushes, but lately, they seemed to be occurring with increasing frequency. Perhaps it was his age, or maybe the approaching anniversary of the accident, but David found his carefully constructed walls beginning to show small cracks. Around noon, as the birthday celebration moved to the castle's private gardens, David maintained his post while keeping a watchful eye on the festivities. He could hear laughter and conversation floating on the warm spring breeze, the sounds painting a picture of family joy that he tried not to let penetrate his professional armor. It was during this time that he first noticed Princess Charlotte watching him. She stood near an ornate garden table laden with birthday treats, her dark eyes fixed on his position with an intensity that seemed unusual for a child on her birthday. David wondered briefly if something was wrong, but protocol dictated that he remain at his post unless specifically summoned. The little princess continued her observation throughout the afternoon, occasionally glancing in his direction while participating in various birthday activities. David found her attention both puzzling and slightly unsettling. In all his years of service, none of the royal children had paid him such sustained attention. He wondered if he had somehow breached protocol or if his uniform was somehow out of place. As the afternoon wore on, David noticed that Princess Charlotte seemed to be growing increasingly restless. While she participated in the various birthday games and activities with appropriate enthusiasm, her gaze kept returning to his position. She would laugh with her cousins, accept gifts with genuine gratitude, and engage in animated conversation with her parents, but every few minutes, her attention would drift back to the stoic figure standing guard near the castle entrance. The princess's behavior didn't go unnoticed by her parents, who followed her gaze several times, though they seemed content to let her work through whatever was capturing her interest. David appreciated their discretion, as it allowed him to maintain his professional composure without the added pressure of direct royal attention. As evening approached and the birthday celebration began to wind down, David prepared for the changing of the guard ceremony that would mark the end of his shift. It had been a long day, made longer by the unexpected emotional memories that had surfaced throughout the afternoon. He looked forward to returning to his modest quarters, where he could process the day's events in private. However, fate had other plans. Just as David was conducting his final security check, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Princess Charlotte had separated herself from the remaining birthday guests and was walking purposefully in his direction. David's training kicked in immediately. He maintained his position and bearing while mentally reviewing the appropriate protocols for interacting with royal children. The little princess approached with the kind of determined confidence that only children possess when they've made up their minds about something important. She stopped just outside the traditional formal distance maintained between guards and royalty, her small hands clasped behind her back in a gesture that seemed both formal and endearing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. David maintained his professional posture while Princess Charlotte seemed to be gathering her thoughts. The silence stretched between them, filled with an odd tension that David couldn't quite identify. He found himself looking down at the small figure before him, noting the way the late afternoon sun caught the highlights in her dark hair and the serious expression that seemed far too mature for her 8 years. When Princess Charlotte finally spoke, her words were soft but clear, carrying across the space between them with surprising authority for such a young voice. "You look very sad," she said simply, her dark eyes meeting his with a directness that caught David completely off guard. The observation hung in the air between them like a challenge to all of David's carefully constructed defenses. In 20 years of royal service, no one had ever acknowledged the pain that he carried, much less a child on her birthday. David felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight control he had maintained for so many years. For the first time in decades, Sergeant David Mitchell found himself at a complete loss for words. All of his training, all of his professional protocols, seemed inadequate in the face of this small girl's simple observation. He stood frozen, looking down at Princess Charlotte, while something deep inside his carefully guarded heart began to crack open. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibilities that David couldn't yet comprehend. Behind them, the sounds of the birthday celebration continued, but, in this small pocket of space between a broken guard and a perceptive princess, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. David's throat constricted as Princess Charlotte's words echoed in his mind. "You look very sad." The simple statement had cut through 20 years of carefully constructed emotional armor with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He stood there, still maintaining his rigid military posture, but, inside, something was unraveling. The little princess continued to watch him with those unervingly perceptive eyes, waiting for a response that David wasn't sure he could provide. His training had prepared him for many scenarios, but none of them had included dealing with a royal child who possessed the uncanny ability to see straight through to his wounded soul. "Your Royal Highness," David began, his voice rougher than intended, "I am perfectly fine." Thank you for your concern." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, and he could see in Charlotte's expression that she wasn't buying his carefully rehearsed deflection for a moment. Charlotte tilted her head slightly, studying him with the kind of intense curiosity that only children possess. "My mummy says that sometimes grown-ups say they're fine when they're not really fine at all," she replied matter-of-factly. "She says that's because grown-ups think they have to be brave all the time, even when being brave makes them more sad." The wisdom in her words struck David like a physical blow. Here was a child, barely 8 years old, articulating truths that he had spent decades trying to deny. He felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to slip, and, for a terrifying moment, he worried that he might actually break down in front of her. "Sometimes," Charlotte continued, stepping slightly closer but still maintaining a respectful distance, "when I'm sad, I like to talk about it. Daddy says that keeping sad feelings inside makes them grow bigger and scarier." She paused, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "Do you have someone to talk to when you're sad?" The question hit David harder than he had expected. The honest answer was no. He had spent so many years isolating himself, pushing away anyone who might have offered comfort or companionship. His fellow guards respected his privacy, his few remaining friends from his military days had long since stopped trying to reach out, and he had deliberately avoided forming any new meaningful relationships. David started, then stopped, unsure how to explain the complexities of his emotional isolation to a child. "I manage just fine on my own, Your Royal Highness." Charlotte's expression softened with a maturity that seemed far beyond her years. "That sounds very lonely," she said quietly. The genuine sympathy in her voice almost undid him completely. Before David could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of the Duchess of Cambridge. Catherine walked toward them with the graceful efficiency of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations, but David could see the curiosity in her eyes as she took in the unusual scene of her daughter engaged in deep conversation with one of the guards. "Charlotte, sweetheart," Catherine said gently, placing a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "I hope you're not bothering Sergeant Mitchell." "I'm not bothering him, Mummy," Charlotte replied with the confident innocence of a child who believed she was helping. "I was just telling him that he looks sad and that it's okay to talk about being sad sometimes." Catherine's eyes met David's for a brief moment, and he saw recognition flash across her features. Perhaps she, too, had noticed the weight he carried, or maybe she simply possessed the same intuitive understanding as her daughter. Either way, her expression conveyed both understanding and gentle concern. "That's very thoughtful of you, darling," Catherine said to Charlotte, her voice warm but diplomatically neutral. "But perhaps Sergeant Mitchell needs to get back to his duties." David seized the opportunity to retreat behind his professional obligations. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. If you'll excuse me, I need to complete my rounds before the evening shift change." But Charlotte wasn't ready to let him go so easily. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked, her small face turned up toward him with an expression of genuine interest. The question caught David off guard. In all his years of service, none of the royal children had ever inquired about his schedule or shown any interest in his continued presence. Yes, Your Royal Highness. I'll be on duty tomorrow as well." Charlotte smiled then, a brilliant expression that transformed her entire face and reminded David so painfully of Emma's smile that he felt his chest tighten. "Good," she said simply. "Maybe we can talk again tomorrow." As Catherine gently guided her daughter back toward the family gathering, David stood alone, feeling more shaken than he had in years. The brief interaction had managed to accomplish what 2 decades of professional distance had been designed to prevent. It had forced him to acknowledge the depth of his emotional isolation and the reality of his ongoing grief. That evening, David completed his duties with mechanical precision, but his mind kept returning to the conversation with Princess Charlotte. Her simple observations had opened something inside him that he had been desperately trying to keep sealed shut. As he walked the familiar corridors of Windsor Castle, checking security points and ensuring everything was secure for the night, he found himself remembering conversations with Emma that had possessed the same kind of innocent wisdom. Emma had been a talker, always full of questions and observations about the world around her. She had possessed an innate empathy that had often surprised David and Sarah with its depth. He remembered one particular evening when Emma had found him sitting quietly in his garden after a particularly difficult day at work. She had climbed into his lap without invitation and declared that he looked crumpled inside. When he had asked her what she meant, she had explained that sometimes people look smooth on the outside but crumpled on the inside, like a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded too many times. The memory brought with it a wave of grief so intense that David had to stop walking and lean against the stone wall of the corridor. For years, he had successfully buried these memories, but Charlotte's intervention had somehow unlocked them, and they were flooding back with vivid clarity. He thought about the accident again, something he usually only allowed himself to do on the anniversary date. The police officer who had come to his door that night had been young, probably not much older than David was now, and he had struggled to find the right words to deliver such devastating news. David remembered the way the officer's hands had shaken slightly as he removed his hat, the way his voice had cracked when he said the words "I'm sorry" and "didn't survive." The aftermath had been a blur of funeral arrangements, well-meaning friends offering comfort he couldn't accept, and the gradual realization that the life he had known was over. Sarah's family had tried to maintain contact, but their presence only served to remind him of everything he had lost. Eventually, even they had stopped calling, respecting his need for solitude even though they didn't understand it. David had convinced himself over the years that isolation was not only preferable but necessary. Emotional attachments led to vulnerability, and vulnerability led to pain. By maintaining professional relationships and avoiding personal connections, he had created a life that was safe, predictable, and emotionally manageable. But Princess Charlotte's simple question, "Do you have someone to talk to when you're sad?" had forced him to confront the cost of that safety. He realized with startling clarity that in protecting himself from further pain, he had also cut himself off from any possibility of healing or happiness. As he completed his final security check of the evening, David found himself wondering what Emma would have thought of Princess Charlotte. The two girls were remarkably similar in many ways, both possessed that same combination of innocence and wisdom, that same ability to see through adult pretenses to the truth underneath. Emma would have liked Charlotte, David realized, and, more importantly, she would have wanted him to be open to the connection that the little princess was offering. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. For 20 years, David had lived with the belief that honoring Emma's memory meant preserving his grief, keeping his love for his lost daughter safely locked away where nothing could diminish it. But, standing alone in the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, he began to wonder if Emma would have wanted something different for him. That night, David lay awake in his small quarters, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation with Princess Charlotte over and over in his mind. Her words had awakened something inside him that he had thought was permanently dormant, a longing for human connection that went beyond professional courtesy and military protocol. He thought about her question regarding tomorrow, about whether he would be there and whether they might talk again. Part of him wanted to arrange his schedule to avoid any further interactions, to retreat back into the safe emotional distance he had maintained for so long. But a larger part of him, a part that sounded suspiciously like Emma's voice, was curious about what might happen if he allowed himself to be vulnerable, even just a little bit. As dawn approached, David made a decision that surprised even himself. Tomorrow, if Princess Charlotte approached him again, he would try to answer her questions honestly. Not with the practiced deflections of a professional guard, but with the honesty that a child's genuine concern deserved. It was a small step, perhaps, but for someone who had spent 20 years standing still, any movement forward felt revolutionary. The morning sun rose over Windsor Castle, casting the same long shadows across the grounds that David had observed the day before. But, as he prepared for another day of duty, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in decades, Sergeant David Mitchell was genuinely curious about what the day might bring, and whether a small princess with wise eyes and a generous heart might continue to challenge the walls he had spent so many years building around his wounded soul. The next morning arrived with an unusual spring in David's step. As he adjusted his uniform and prepared for his shift, he found himself paying extra attention to his appearance, not out of vanity, but from a newfound sense that today might be different. The conversation with Princess Charlotte had left him feeling exposed yet oddly hopeful, as if a door he had kept locked for 20 years was finally beginning to creak open. David took his position at the castle entrance with the same military precision he had maintained for decades, but, inside, he felt a nervous energy that reminded him of his first day on the job. Would Princess Charlotte seek him out again? part of him hoped she would forget about their conversation and return to the typical royal child's disinterest in the staff. Another part of him, a part that was growing stronger by the hour, found himself genuinely hoping she would approach him again. The morning passed quietly, with David observing the usual bustle of castle life while trying to maintain his professional demeanor. Gardeners tended to the spring flowers, staff members hurried between buildings carrying out their various duties, and the royal family went about their private routines largely out of sight. David found his attention drawn repeatedly to windows and doorways, unconsciously searching for a small figure with dark hair and perceptive eyes. It wasn't until nearly noon that Princess Charlotte appeared. She emerged from the castle's main entrance with her characteristic purposeful stride, but today she seemed less confident than she had the day before. David watched as she approached, noting the way she kept glancing around as if checking to make sure no one was watching their interaction. "Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell," she said formally when she reached an appropriate distance from his position. There was something different about her demeanor today, more cautious, perhaps even slightly nervous. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," David replied, offering a slight bow that was both professionally appropriate and genuinely respectful. "I trust you enjoyed the remainder of your birthday celebration yesterday." Charlotte smiled at that, some of her natural warmth returning to her expression. "It was lovely, thank you. Though I kept thinking about our conversation." She paused, studying his face with that same unsettling directness she had displayed the day before. "Did you think about it too?" The question caught David off guard with its honest directness. A child's inability to engage in the polite deceptions that adults used as social lubricant could be both refreshing and terrifying. "I did think about it, yes," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Good," Charlotte said, seeming pleased with his response. "Because I have more questions, if that's all right." David felt his stomach tighten with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Though I should mention that my duties require me to maintain my position and remain alert to my surroundings." "I understand," Charlotte replied seriously. "Daddy explained about duty and responsibility. He said that some jobs are very important and require people to be very focused." She paused thoughtfully. "But he also said that being focused doesn't mean you can't have conversations, as long as you're still doing your job properly." David found himself impressed by the princess's mature understanding of professional obligations. "Your father is quite correct," he acknowledged. "What would you like to know?" Charlotte seemed to consider her words carefully before speaking. "Yesterday, when I said you looked sad, you said you were fine. But I don't think that was really true." She looked up at him with those disconcerting perceptive eyes. "My mummy says that sometimes it's okay to not be fine, and that pretending to be fine when you're not can make things worse." The observation hit David with the same unexpected force as her comments the day before. He stood there, maintaining his military bearing while internally struggling with how to respond to such profound insight from an 8-year-old child. "Your mother is a very wise woman," he said finally. "She is," Charlotte agreed readily. "She also says that everyone has sad stories, but that doesn't mean the sad stories have to be the end of all the stories." The little princess tilted her head slightly. "Do you have a sad story, Sergeant Mitchell?" David felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied thoughts of Emma and Sarah. For 20 years, he had successfully avoided discussing his personal tragedy with anyone, deflecting questions and maintaining the privacy that had become his shield against the world. But, standing here, looking down at this small girl who somehow managed to see through all his carefully constructed defenses, David found himself wanting to be honest. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. "I do have a sad story." Charlotte nodded as if this confirmation was exactly what she had expected. "Would you like to tell me about it?" Sometimes telling sad stories to someone else makes them a little less heavy to carry. The simplicity of her offer, coupled with the genuine compassion in her young voice, nearly undid David completely. He looked down at her, the small princess who had somehow appointed herself as his unofficial counselor, and felt something crack open inside his chest. "I had a daughter once," David began, his words coming slowly and carefully, as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory. "She was about your age. Her name was Emma." "Had?" Charlotte asked gently, her young mind immediately picking up on the past tense and its implications. David nodded, swallowing hard before continuing. She died in a car accident, along with my wife Sarah. It was a long time ago, but... He trailed off, unsure how to explain the persistent nature of grief to a child. But sad stories don't really go away, do they? Charlotte finished for him, her voice soft with understanding that seemed far beyond her years. They just become part of who you are. Yes, David whispered, amazed by her intuitive grasp of something he had struggled to understand for decades. Exactly like that. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. When she spoke again, her words carried a maturity that David found both touching and heartbreaking. That's why you look so sad all the time. You miss them. Every day, David admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. It was the first time he had spoken those words aloud to another person, and the relief he felt was both unexpected and overwhelming. What was Emma like? Charlotte asked, and David could hear the genuine curiosity in her voice. Was she funny? Did she like to read? What were her favorite things? The questions opened another door in David's memory, but, this time, instead of the usual wave of crushing grief, he found himself smiling slightly. She was very much like you, actually, he said. She asked a lot of questions, and she had a way of seeing things that adults missed. She loved to read, and she was fascinated by horses. She wanted to learn to ride, but... He stopped himself, not wanting to venture into the territory of interrupted plans and unfulfilled dreams. But the accident happened before she could, Charlotte finished gently. That's very sad. It is, David agreed. But, you know what? I had forgotten about her wanting to learn to ride until just now. I had forgotten a lot of things about her, actually. For a long time, I was so sad about losing her that I stopped remembering the good things about having her. Charlotte considered this carefully. Maybe that's why you look so sad, she said thoughtfully. Maybe you've been so busy missing Emma that you forgot to remember the happy parts of having Emma. The insight struck David with stunning clarity. This child had just articulated something that years of avoiding therapy and professional help had never allowed him to understand. He had become so focused on his loss that he had stopped celebrating the gift of the time he had been given with his daughter. I think you might be right about that, David said, his voice filled with wonder at this small girl's wisdom. My great-grandmother died last year, Charlotte said suddenly. I was very sad about it because I loved her very much. But, Mummy helped me understand that being sad about someone being gone doesn't mean you have to stop being happy about having known them. David felt tears threatening for the first time in years. Not the bitter tears of grief he had shed in private, but something different, tears of recognition, of gratitude, of a healing he hadn't even realized he needed. Your great-grandmother must have been very special, he managed. She was, Charlotte agreed. Just like Emma was special to you. The little princess looked up at him with those wise, compassionate eyes. I think Emma would want you to remember the happy things about her, don't you? The question hung in the air between them, and David found himself considering it seriously. What would Emma want for him? Would she want him to spend the rest of his life locked away in grief, honoring her memory through isolation and sadness? Or would she want something different, something better? The answer came to him with startling clarity. Emma had been a child who loved life, who found joy in small things, who believed in possibilities and adventures. She would be heartbroken to know that her death had caused her father to stop living, to stop connecting with other people, to stop finding reasons to smile. Yes, David said finally, his voice stronger than it had been all morning. I think she would want me to remember the happy things. Charlotte beamed at this response, her face lighting up with a joy that seemed to encompass far more than just this conversation. Would you tell me a happy story about Emma sometime? She asked. I would like to hear about the happy things. Before David could respond, they were again interrupted by the approach of footsteps. This time, however, it was Prince William who appeared, his expression showing the same mixture of curiosity and gentle concern that his wife had displayed the day before. Charlotte, there you are, he said warmly. Your mother was looking for you. His eyes moved to David with recognition and respect. "Good afternoon, Sergeant Mitchell." "Your Royal Highness," David replied with appropriate formality, though he felt less need to retreat behind protocol than he had the day before. "Daddy, I was talking to Sergeant Mitchell about sad stories and happy stories," Charlotte announced with the forthright honesty that seemed to characterize all her interactions. William's eyebrows rose slightly at this declaration, and David could see him processing the implications of his daughter's words. "I see," he said carefully. "That sounds like a very important conversation." It was, Charlotte confirmed. "Sergeant Mitchell has a sad story about his daughter Emma, but I think he's starting to remember the happy parts too." David felt his face flush with embarrassment at having his personal business discussed so openly, but when he looked at Prince William's expression, he saw only compassion and understanding. "Happy memories are precious things," William said quietly, and David could hear something personal in his voice that suggested he, too, understood the complex relationship between grief and joy. "I'm glad you two have had a chance to talk about them." The simple acknowledgement from someone who clearly understood the weight of loss created another crack in David's emotional armor. Here was a man who had lost his mother at a young age, who understood the complexity of grief in the public eye, offering validation for a conversation that David had never thought possible. 3 months had passed since that transformative conversation with Princess Charlotte, and David Mitchell found himself living in a world he barely recognized. The change hadn't happened overnight, it had been a gradual process of small moments, tentative steps toward healing, and the slow reconstruction of a heart that had been broken for far too long. True to her word, Princess Charlotte had continued seeking him out during his duty shifts, always with new questions or observations that seemed designed to gently push David toward emotional honesty. Their conversations had become a treasured part of his routine, something he looked forward to with an anticipation that would have seemed impossible just months before. On this particular morning, as David took his position at Windsor Castle, he felt the familiar flutter of expectation that had become part of his daily experience. Charlotte would likely appear sometime before noon, full of stories about her latest adventures or questions about his memories of Emma. Over the weeks, David had shared dozens of stories about his daughter, her first steps, her fascination with butterflies, the way she insisted on wearing her princess dress to the grocery store, her elaborate plans for her 9th birthday party that would never happen. But something was different about this day. Instead of the usual bright energy he had come to associate with Charlotte's visits, David noticed that when she appeared, she seemed subdued, almost hesitant. She approached his position with less confidence than usual, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," David said, immediately noticing her unusual demeanor. "You seem thoughtful today." Charlotte looked up at him with those perceptive eyes, but today they seemed clouded with something David couldn't immediately identify. "Sergeant Mitchell," she began carefully, "I have something I want to ask you, but I'm not sure how to say it." David felt a familiar tightness in his chest, wondering if he had somehow overstepped boundaries during their previous conversations. "You can ask me anything, Your Royal Highness. You know that by now." Charlotte took a deep breath, gathering her courage in the way that only children do when they're about to venture into territory they know might be complicated. "Next week is the anniversary of Emma's accident," she said quietly. "You told me the date a few weeks ago, and I remembered it because..." She trailed off, seeming to struggle with her words. David felt his breath catch. He had mentioned the date almost casually during one of their conversations, not thinking that Charlotte would remember such a detail or understand its significance. "Yes," he said softly. "It is." "I was wondering," Charlotte continued, her voice gaining strength, "if you would like to do something special to remember Emma on that day. Something happy instead of just sad." The suggestion hit David with unexpected force. For 25 years, the anniversary of the accident had been a day of solitary grief, a date he dreaded and endured in private agony. The idea of transforming it into something positive, something celebratory, was both terrifying and intriguing. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, genuinely curious about what this remarkable child might suggest. Charlotte's face brightened slightly at his interest. "Well, you said Emma loved horses and wanted to learn to ride. And you said she loved princess dresses and birthday parties and butterflies." The little princess paused, organizing her thoughts. I thought maybe we could have a small party in the garden, with horses from the royal stables, and we could release butterflies and maybe you could tell everyone the happy stories about Emma." David felt tears pricking at his eyes for what had become a surprisingly common occurrence over the past few months. The thoughtfulness of Charlotte's suggestion, the careful way she had woven together all the details he had shared about Emma, overwhelmed him with gratitude and something else he was only beginning to recognize as hope. "That sounds beautiful," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not sure such an event would be appropriate, given my position and—" "I already asked Mummy and Daddy," Charlotte interrupted with the confidence of a child who had planned ahead. "They said it would be lovely, and that they would be honored to help us remember Emma properly." David stared down at this small girl who had somehow managed to orchestrate what amounted to a memorial celebration for a daughter he had spent decades grieving in isolation. The kindness of the gesture, the thought that had gone into planning it, the willingness of the royal family to participate in honoring a guard's lost child, it was almost too much to process. "I don't know what to say," David whispered. "Say yes," Charlotte replied simply. "Emma would want you to celebrate her, wouldn't she? She would want people to know about all the wonderful things she was and all the joy she brought to your life." The truth of those words resonated through David's entire being. Emma would indeed want to be celebrated rather than mourned. She had been a child who embraced life with enthusiasm, who found wonder in simple things, who believed that every day held the possibility for adventure and joy. A memorial celebration was exactly what she would have wanted. "Yes," David said, the word coming out stronger than he had expected. "Emma would want that very much." Charlotte's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with pure joy. "Wonderful! I'll tell Mummy and Daddy, and we can start planning everything properly." Over the following week, David watched in amazement as the royal family threw themselves into planning Emma's memorial celebration with the same attention to detail they might have devoted to a state function. Catherine personally oversaw the selection of butterflies from a local conservatory, William arranged for several gentle horses from the royal stables to be brought to the castle gardens, and various staff members contributed their own touches to what was becoming a genuinely meaningful event. But it was Charlotte who remained the driving force behind every decision, carefully consulting with David about each element to ensure it properly honored Emma's memory. She had somehow transformed what could have been a simple gesture into something profound and healing. The day of the celebration dawned bright and clear, with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for outdoor gatherings. David had requested the day off from his regular duties, and, as he prepared to join the royal family in the castle gardens, he found himself thinking about Emma with a lightness he hadn't experienced in 25 years. When he arrived at the designated area, David was amazed by what he saw. The garden had been transformed into something magical, with colorful decorations that managed to be both festive and tasteful. A small table held photographs that David had provided, pictures of Emma laughing, playing, dressed in her beloved princess costume. Near the table, several beautiful horses grazed peacefully, their presence adding to the dreamlike quality of the scene. Catherine and William were already present, along with their children and several close staff members who had become invested in the celebration. But it was Charlotte who immediately approached David, her face glowing with excitement and pride. "Do you like it?" she asked anxiously. "Does it feel right for Emma?" David looked around at the beautiful scene, at the faces of people who had come together to honor a child they had never met, at the careful attention to details that had made Emma special. "It's perfect," he said honestly. "Emma would have loved every bit of this." The celebration that followed was unlike anything David could have imagined. Charlotte had prepared a small speech about the importance of remembering people with joy rather than just sadness. William spoke about the privilege of honoring Emma's memory and the courage it takes to transform grief into gratitude. Catherine read a poem about children who become angels, her voice gentle and full of genuine emotion. But it was when David himself was invited to share stories about Emma that the true magic of the day revealed itself. Standing before this small group of people who had opened their hearts to his daughter's memory, David found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in decades. He spoke about Emma's infectious laughter, her elaborate imaginative games, her kindness toward animals, her absolute belief that princesses could be anything they wanted to be. As he talked, David realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. The pain of losing Emma would always be with him, but, for the first time in 25 years, he was able to access the joy of having had her without that joy being immediately overwhelmed by grief. Charlotte's intervention had somehow taught him that loving Emma's memory didn't require him to remain trapped in the moment of losing her. When it came time to release the butterflies, Charlotte took David's hand and, together they opened the containers that held dozens of colorful monarchs. As the butterflies took flight, swirling around the garden in a display of natural beauty that took everyone's breath away, David felt something he had thought lost forever, a sense of peace. "Look," Charlotte whispered, pointing upward where several butterflies seemed to be dancing together in the spring sunlight. "Emma's here with us." David followed her gaze, watching the graceful flight of the butterflies, and, for a moment, he could almost feel his daughter's presence. Not the heartbreaking absence that had haunted him for so long, but something warmer, a sense of connection that transcended loss. As the celebration continued into the afternoon, David found himself genuinely laughing for the first time in decades. He watched Charlotte playing with the horses, teaching the other children about proper horse care with the authority of someone who had clearly been preparing for this moment. He listened to William and Catherine share their own stories about the importance of memory and healing. He accepted condolences and congratulations from staff members who had worked beside him for years without knowing anything about his personal tragedy. When the day finally drew to a close and the garden began to empty, Charlotte approached David one final time. She was tired now, her energy spent on the emotional intensity of the day, but her eyes still held that familiar wisdom that had first captured his attention. "Thank you," she said simply, "for trusting me with Emma's stories. For letting us help you remember her the right way." David knelt down so that he was at eye level with this remarkable child who had somehow managed to heal a heart he had thought permanently broken. "No, Your Royal Highness," he said gently. "Thank you. You gave me back my daughter in a way I never thought possible. You showed me that love doesn't end with loss, it just changes form." Charlotte smiled, that radiant expression that had become so familiar to David over the past months. "Emma would be proud of you," she said with the confident certainty of a child who believed absolutely in the truth of her words. "She would be happy that you're happy again." As David walked back to his quarters that evening, he found himself thinking about the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 months ago, he had been a man trapped in grief, isolated by his own pain and convinced that healing meant forgetting. Tonight, he was someone who could speak his daughter's name with joy, who could share her memory with others, who could imagine a future that honored her life rather than just mourning her death. It had taken the wisdom of an 8-year-old princess to show him that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the smallest gestures of compassion. Charlotte had seen through his professional armor to the wounded father beneath, and, with the fearless empathy that only children possess, she had refused to let him remain isolated in his pain. That night, for the first time in 25 years, David Mitchell fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming not of the accident that had taken his family away, but of butterflies dancing in sunlight and a little girl who had taught him that love was stronger than loss, that joy could coexist with grief, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships could change everything. The next morning, David would return to his duties as a member of the Royal Guard, but he would do so as a fundamentally different man, one who had learned that opening his heart to connection didn't diminish his love for Emma, but rather allowed that love to grow and touch other lives in ways he had never imagined possible.